Good evening, everyone. The Tuesday, July 18th meeting of the Transportation Committee is called to order at 6:30 p.m. We have a couple of things on the agenda. First is approval of the minutes from June 20th.
Mr. Chairman, I move approval of the minutes of the June 20th meeting.
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
The record will reflect we approve the minutes unanimously. Second on the agenda is O-2817, removing city employee parking from Hillman Garage, postponed from the last committee meeting. The sponsor of the bill, that's me, hi, has proposed some amendments that I circulated about a week ago. And I understand some of you may wish to comment on those amendments, and I invite anyone who would wish to do so to come up to the mic and speak your mind. Thank you, Mr. Bryce.
With the sun here, you can't really see whether the green light's on or not, so I now know that it is on.
Would you state your name and
Yes.
address for the or position
My
for the
name
record?
is Samuel McLean Bryce. I reside at 1811 Old Annapolis Boulevard, Annapolis, Maryland. This is, the fourth time I've spoken to members of the council about this in the public, and I think one of the things that's very interesting about it is when you look at sort of the people who are speaking and coming up, we're all the really senior employees. We're the people with multiple years. Many of us are eligible to retire at this point. And one of the reasons we're coming up to talk about this is because we are looking out for the people who follow us. We want to make sure that the city maintains a good, strong work staff, that they're going to be able to continue to bring the city forward into the 21st century. To do that, you have to always have sufficient salaries and benefits that will attract those people, because you are competing with everybody who is around you. Before we discuss we have a very basic general concern with the amendments that have been proposed, but I think what we have seen so far in the reasoning for this proposed bill is flawed or inaccurate or incorrectly presented. One of the things we found out recently is that when we look at the studies, we talked about 180 passes were the city passes. What we have found out is that there's actually somewhere around 130 to 135 passes are city passes. Of that 135, approximately 100 of those are for the employees who work on site, meaning 145 Gorman, City Hall, or the old fire hall. The remainder are for employees, aldermen, part-time employees, committee support staff, or others who have been given a pass. They're not the people who come in here on a day-to-day basis. In addition to that, SP Plus has 18 passes. APD has 7. When we looked at the parking study that SP Plus did, on page 20, it states that Hillman is 92% full. Sounds like we're really maxing out there. But it's not a count of the maximum use of the garage. It's a count of how many spaces were utilized during the workday. So it doesn't take into account the fact that the garage is actually a transient facility. There are people who come in, go to the restaurants, go to the shops, and then leave. If you simply assign a more reasonable approach to it for the transients, what you find out is that the rate that they've for the date that they've picked out is more in the vicinity of 68 to 70%, which is 310 vehicles, which is about 3 floors. And if you consider what the employees see anecdotally, that's about what we see on the typical day in the parking garage. We see that 4th floor has got the city vehicles that are the pool cars and a few extra cars. We don't see that 4th floor full that frequently. And if you remove the city employees from the mix, what you now got is a parking garage its occupancy rates falls to under 50%. You know, the rationale there doesn't seem to make sense. The other thing we discovered, and this I think is something that really plays into the public perception. The full sign is on when the garage isn't full. And I don't mean when the garage is at 90%. I mean when the garage is half full, quarter full, 6 o'clock in the morning. And what we found out was the full sign doesn't go on by some trigger mechanism. You know, the counter says, you've got so many cars in here. Full sign goes on because someone flips a switch. It's all manually operated, on and off. And I would say that maybe we were wrong, except one of our employees, because they saw a long line back up at the exit on a Sunday when they were in here. They went down to tell the operator that A, the full light was on, and B, they had a long line at the Borman Street entrance, Duke of Gloucester Street entrance, and they told them, oh, the sign goes on because we turn it on. And we don't have a camera, so we didn't even know that there was a backup at the Duke of Gloucester Street entrance. So I brought that up in a staff meeting, and Ricky Miller said, oh, of course, it's on a switch. That's why it goes on and goes off at strange intervals. All in all, what we're seeing is the study that needed to be done before this proposed ordinance was brought forward was never done. And so much of the information is bad or inaccurate that before it goes any further, you really need to pull it back and look at this in a hard way, a hard, detailed way. And it can't be done by anyone working with the city at this point because it's just not going to be trusted. I'll be very blunt and honest about that. When we look specifically at your amendments that you have proposed, there is a true concern that they are insufficiently detailed. What constitutes 95% full? Is it, oh, it went 95% full for a minute? Did it go 95% full for an hour, 3 hours? What's going to be considered 95% full? That needs to be specified so that everyone knows what the criteria is. And that needs to be a number that is certified, that we know it is an accurate number, because as I've just told you, nothing we've seen so far has been accurate. Second thing that needs to be done is, if this is going to occur, there needs to be a measure or provision of how you're going to allocate the spaces. We need to see that, we want to see that up front. And I would suggest that, given the fact that there are, it's been proposed 60, we're talking about 100 spaces, or about 100 employees, plus the pool cars, I would suggest that that be the number you're working with. And then those between 100 and 135 should use the blue tickets as passes. They are not people who are in here every day. You know, they are the people who are transient, in a way transient people who are coming through. But we would want to know how that was being specified. We would also want to know what was the provision for the city employees returning to the parking garage, or was this gone forever? We would also want to see assurance that when the new parking garage is built, because at some point that garage is going to outlive its usefulness or its life expectancy. We'd want to ensure that the employees were going to get parking spaces and that garage was going to be built with sufficient capacity to provide those parking spaces. I think in closing, what I would say is a response to the question that Alderman Budge asked me. You know, because I didn't understand the question he asked at the last meeting about what should you tell people. I think you need to tell people the truth. I think that people need to hear what's going on. I think that you can't just come forward and look at bad numbers and then use that to justify removing the city employees. And that applies across the board, whether it's the budget, projects, whatever. You know, we have to stop going with the political line, and we have to start to tell the people the truth, because you just have to look outside. You know, we're going broke because we keep making promises that we can't fulfill. That's my little editorial on this. That is all I have to add to this. So, thank you very much for hearing me.
Thank you. Mr. Kemp, Mr. Gordon, would you care to add anything? Anyone else?
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Bryce.
Mr. Chairman, would you like to talk about your amendments here? Since obviously these are new since we last discussed the
certainly. I proposed 3 amendments. The first seeks to implement a mechanism instituting a threshold, as we had heard in testimony up through the last committee meeting. The perception was that the garage was not full often enough to warrant the exclusion of employees. So the threshold I set would be if the garage was at 90% or greater occupancy. This says for 3 days per week. That should be 3 work days per week. On average in a calendar quarter, then the remaining provisions of the bill would kick in. The Second Amendment addresses the number of employee spaces that would remain after these provisions kicked in. In the initial draft of the legislation, we said 20 employee passes would remain. Looking at the zoning code requires 59 parking spaces within 500 feet of the Gorman City Hall firehouse offices and this assembly room. So we rounded that up to 60 and suggested that as an amendment. And then finally, we had heard a number of comments that having this legislation be implemented essentially almost immediately was not practical in any terms for employees who needed to adjust daycare, family schedules, and so forth. So up in the threshold part of the amendments, I propose that when the threshold is crossed and these provisions kick in, they kick in 90 days following. And then, so the Amendment 3 changes the start date of the legislation to immediately, because that starts the mechanism that looks at the thresholds, if you follow me.
Sure.
Who's responsible for doing these 95% counts, and 3 work days a week? How's that managed?
That is as reported to us by the parking contractor now.
So to Mr. Bryce's example, if the true number is 100 passes, when you take out the people who are not here every day, and if you were to take these amendments and approve them, 60 would not be subject to any removal.
Correct.
So you're really talking about 40 of the 100 that would be subject to this 95% at some point,
Yes.
or not, if it never triggered.
Yes, exactly. And in originally crafting this legislation, I intentionally left out the mechanism for how
You select the 40.
how you would select whoever didn't get the passes or whoever
Yeah.
did get the passes. With the philosophical assumption that that's management's job, not the city council's. That the city manager or his staff would sort that out with the department heads. So there we are. Is there any support for the amendments?
Well, I mean, I certainly, I think Alderman Kirby's in the same spot, had questions about the underlying ordinance. I think these, well, I'm not sure exactly how that would work. I think it adds a lot of, I mean, if you look at it from the simple test, do they improve the ordinance? I think they probably would, but the larger question is, should we be doing this? Is this the right time to be doing this? How do we look at it is sort of the questions that I'm wrestling with. But yeah, I mean, in general, having some sort of trigger so it doesn't just happen by fiat, I think makes some sense. But
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Yeah, I also, I think that there's some pluses in the amendments, but as it stands on face, I don't think that our employees out here, because they're thrilled with you right now. So I certainly don't see where the rationale Mr. Bryce spoke of politically. I don't think anybody's in love with this, or they wouldn't be here tonight. The other thing is, I think at some point, I've wondered about this full light on and off, and what constitutes full. And I think when I asked the question, I was told that there were X number of monthly passes that's in the garage, and when the number of cars enter the garage, and even though it appeared from the street that the garage was empty, there were empty spaces up there. It was actually full because those were people who held monthly passes. Am I correct?
Use the mic.
Thanks.
And please identify yourself.
Yeah, John Kemp, SP Plus, Annapolis Parking. Your presumption, Alderman Kirby, is correct. So if there are, as the garage fills, if there's, let's say, 200 monthly parking access cards out there available for use, and 100 of them are currently in the garage, yet there are, we look at that number, the amount of monthly access cards that are in the garage, at the same time that we're looking at the number of spaces that are available. And generally, a general rule is, because there are so many city cards out there that aren't used at any given time, there's about 80 to 85 of the 137 that are consistently used. Not necessarily the same 80, but there's always 80 to 85 city cards in the garage at peak, midday. Your typical monthly parker or monthly parker group non-city employee, but rather a commercial or an individual who has a monthly access card. That is usually about 80 to 85% of the time. Those monthly cards are in at peak. And so you consider the number of monthly access cards that are in, that have a status of in, at the same time that you look at the number of spaces available as you get through the day. If you're seeing swaths of spaces that are not occupied, that threshold is very low. So even with those two considered, even if you're in a day when it just so happens that of the 200 access cards that are out there, there's only 50 cards in the garage, we would not hold 150 spaces, presuming that perhaps there might be 150 monthly card holders come in. So if you're seeing swaths of space open, and yet a full sign is up. For example, I was speaking with an employee, Brian Snyder, who works in the building across the street here, about this topic, and he had met with, and I don't recall the day that he had met with other colleagues. They saw that the full light was on at like 5 o'clock in the afternoon recently, within the last week. And I recalled the instance with Mr. Snyder, and it just so happened that both myself and another one of my colleagues we had a conversation with the folks working at that particular time, because it was a full sign that remained up that shouldn't have been, shouldn't remain up. So my point is that if you see swaths of open spaces, that is a human error that the full sign has stayed on. It's not that we don't hold large number of spaces for monthly cards that might not otherwise be in the garage, if that makes sense. But there is a consideration of how many monthly parking cards are in and how many spaces are left.
Okay. Thanks.
Taking off my legislative hat for a second, when the full sign is left on accidentally through human error, that represents a considerable opportunity for lost revenue for the city. What is SP Plus doing to control that?
So we've got a system of checks in to ensure that the full sign is not left on, and in this particular case, that person didn't go through those, and we're disciplining the employees that have known responsibility for making sure that when they come on, that their checklist is completed, and one of those items is that signs are in a status that they should be in.
Thank you. Any further questions from my colleagues?
Yeah, I guess I don't have questions for you. No, sir. But I still, getting back to the Amendment 2, that we strike 20, we put 60. It still leaves 40 people that's going to be without a parking space, whether they're tenured employees, young or old. And I clearly understand the logic. When you took a job, transportation's always key in anybody taking a job, regardless of how trivial it is, and parking is like a part of your job. So, I mean, if I sat in your spaces, and I've been here for a couple of years, didn't even have to be 10 or 20 to have the rug pulled out from under me, I'd be pretty much not happy. So I completely understand that. I think if anything we can do to raise morale, that's what we need to be doing. I do understand the need to solve this problem. I don't think right now it needs to be solved, especially with the new garage coming online, not having a timetable for it. And I believe this whole thing and all of this resentment and everything else that's going to come out of this can be better achieved when we have a timetable for a brand new garage. At the same time, we deal with employee parking. I just don't think that time is right now. And I can assure you that the alderman's not getting any mileage out of it, politically. I mean, I just put myself in his seat. And, I hang out in Ward 1 for 2 hours. He's here all day, sleeps here. So I don't think that that's happening at all. But I don't know. Where do we go?
Mr. Chairman, I guess I'm approaching this similar to Alderman Kirby. I think I understand that it is sort of an article of faith on the part of some residents that the answer to the parking problem is to get the city employees out of the parking garage and everything else will sort of flow from there. And while I think in the abstract, I understand why that is, because it is one thing we can control in a world where there's lots of other things we may not be able to control downtown that go to the health of the business district and all of those sort of issues, but I'm just not sure is the answer. So I guess I'm questioning sort of the timing of doing this or how we do it. I think I'm happy to support the amendments. I think they improve the underlying bill, but I'm not going to be a vote for the underlying bill either today or before the council. I just don't think it's the right time, and maybe when the next council sits and someone else has my seat, they can figure out how to come up with a better plan that would work and deliver on the goals of what the residents and the employees want. I just think with the short amount of time, I'm not sure we can get there, although I do applaud you for your efforts to try and figure out how to improve it. But so that's sort of my inclination. I know as a question, I mean, we basically have to make a recommendation to the council. We don't have the ability to just bottle it up and hold it here in the committee. So, I mean, I would be happy to recommend approval of the amendments 1 through 3 to the underlying bill, O-2817.
I can second that, and I will second it with same underlying issues that the Alderman Pfeiffer has put forth. We shouldn't hold it here in front of full council. It is an attempt to iron some kinks out. I think it's ready to stand the test, but I also don't think I will support the bill as is.
Thank you. So the amendments have been moved and seconded with hopefully a friendly amendment to make those 3 days 3 work days.
Absolutely.
Okay. Any further discussion on the amendments?
No, sir.
All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
We're unanimous on the amendments. Now I will take a motion on the underlying bill with amendments.
Mr. Chairman, I would move that we recommend to the full council O-2817 with a negative recommendation.
Second.
Any further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Nay. So the O-28 goes to the council with a negative recommendation from this committee. We expect that, or I expect it will probably be in front of the council at our meeting on the 31st. Is there any further? We've concluded the agenda. Any further business for the committee? Anything for the good of the order?
No, sir.
Alderman Kirby, we were talking before where you said since we have transportation staff here, would you like to get into questions
Yes.
about those lots?
Yes. And has it been? Is that coming to us? The mayor has proposed
The non-city.
some ordinances with for these parking lots.
Yes. That will come to us after the public hearing,
Okay.
which will be
And Mr. Gordon, what initially my concern is going to be, if that's in fact done, will they be required to use the towing companies that the city use right now, such as JP Towing and Macy's?
Will the private
The
companies
private
be
owners.
required? I don't think they will be.
Okay.
The legislation as written does not
Okay.
require that the private companies use the tow companies that the
Okay.
city has in place.
And
I don't, if I may interrupt.
Absolutely.
I don't think that we can specify that. Towing from private lots is regulated by state law. And I
Okay.
don't think we can override the state law.
Okay. Okay, well, it's just something to think about. I know that's gonna come up. It sets up a scenario where there can be tons of abuses. So yeah, and I know that occurs right now in private sector developments across the city. So yeah, that'll be something we'll have to pay attention to with the legislation. Okay, thanks,
Okay.
Alderman.
Great. Anything further? Take a motion.
Move we adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
We are adjourned.